The Robertses had moved into their house in 1946, when it was still a common lodging house, like many other houses in the street. Today, of course, it's been taken over by a completely different group of people and is a wealthy man's area. But then they took one room, and as other rooms became vacant, they moved in and took them over. They'd been living in Oxford during the war, and presumably they were making a little money. He was selling paintings again. And at some point, the house became available for sale, with themselves as the only sitting tenants left. And here a friend, Victoria Kingsley, gave them the money to buy it. It was about £1,200, which they hadn't got, without strings. And so they became the owners of a very attractive house, which for William Roberts gave him a security which other artists of his generation never had. I had become Sarah Roberts's walking companion. One day we had come back on the bus and she'd left her umbrella. I got off a stop later, went back to the house with the umbrella, knocked on the door, and the door had two mottled panels of glass, and anyone coming to the door, it looked as though their face and clothes had been broken up into patches of colours, and to my surprise I realised it was not Sarah coming to the door, it was William Roberts himself, the very high purply red colour of his face visible through the glass. Well, I knew he was he who must not be spoken to, so I opened the letterbox and put the umbrella through, saying through the letterbox, Sarah left her umbrella on the bus, I thought it better to bring it back. And there was a pause, and then he bent down to the letterbox and in a strangled voice said, "Thank you very much." And that was the first time I spoke to him. When visitors came to the house, they were normally asked to come down to the side door, down a set of rather sharp concrete steps where you could scuff your shoes or even trip and stumble. The front door was not to be used, and it was quite obvious that you were not meant to walk past the studio on the right, where William would be working. After William Roberts' death, visitors were occasionally allowed to come in via the front door. And there they would find an easel which had been ornamented with a row of sticks and one or two umbrellas. This was Jacob Kramer's easel, which had come into the house after Millie's household had been broken up. Millie, who had so much adored her brother Jacob, had kept the easel, and Sarah seemed to have a slightly equivocal, ambiguous attitude to the easel, and I just wondered that she was decorating it in this way with her sticks. She took up a stick quite late in life, when her hip began to give her trouble in her late 70s, and she used it in a very special way. The stick used to hail a taxi, be waved to underline something she was saying, point aggressively at someone. It became an extension of her personality. William Roberts spent every day in the studio, from early morning, break for lunch, and presumably 11s, and at 6 o'clock was the end of his working day. Sarah, who was very sociable, never got further than tea parties in his lifetime, and as it came nearer to 6 o'clock, she would show signs of nervousness, restlessness, and begin to suggest that it was time to leave. I noticed that in the winter, if we were sitting in the sitting room for our tea, he would come down sometimes a little earlier than 6 o'clock and would sit on the brick wall, supporting the lawn, looking in at us with an extremely impish, sometimes even malicious look on his face. And if the tea party were in the garden in the summer, he would come into the sitting room and bumble about there quite deliberately in order to be seen by Sarah and the guests, to show that it was time to go away. "Shoo," she would say, "shoo, shoo," and we would pick up a sort of clobber and have to leave by the back gate if it was the garden, and by the side door if we were in the sitting room. Obviously, the life of the house had been organised around his working method. His method of work had been the same over so many years. The small drawing, often made while sitting in the tea room, ABC tea room. He was quite a connoisseur of tea rooms. Then came the watercolour, the squared up drawing, the squared up watercolor, then often the highly finished watercolor. These were very saleable. They were the right price, the right size. People were happy to buy those. Probably a fair amount of their income came from the sale of these. Then the larger oil painting, which was not always so saleable. Sarah, of course, was his model. He seemed to have no other. She would often say, "I can't come out, I'm sitting today." And this was a very important part of her day. She had the perfect feeling for the right gesture, and this must have made her the perfect model for his paintings full of action. The studio was William's kingdom, but the kitchen was Sarah's. He, of course, as the son of a carpenter from Hackney, was quite a dab hand with a saw, hammer, nails. In fact, the case with his carpentry tools is still in the pantry. And he went to work in the kitchen to make very attractive shelving, very solid shelving, to display all Sarah's collection of pots, often made by friends or picked up abroad, early Le Creuset enamelware in very good condition, and all the bits and pieces which she showed with great style. She said she had no artistic talents, but she certainly had a talent for arranging and making things look good. He had his own system of bolts and bars, rather like Kate Barlas' bars, with a toggle and a sliding bolt in wood. He fitted up a kitchen cabinet with large doorknobs, very attractively. The cupboards were put there by him too, for all the changes of curtains, table linen. The house was extremely well arranged. There were hooks, there were little special places to hang things, to put things. Everything had its place. Sarah, of course, was a Yorkshire woman, and good food, well-kept kitchen, very important to her. The little table with its sycamore top she often scrubbed with an egg. She had been told this was the correct thing to do. They ate here. Here they had lunch and supper, well-cooked food, savoury food. Sarah would sometimes say, "What am I to cook this evening? I know, I'll give us savoury rice." The sitting room was, of course, where most visitors were at home. The round tables they favoured, standing on a pedestal with 3 little feet in the window, and that was where afternoon tea was served. Walking through into the kitchen sometimes to help Sarah bring in the plates of buttered tea matzo biscuits, which she considered a treat, or the digestive biscuits, which I think all the Roberts favoured. They were connoisseurs of digestive biscuits and would claim that there were certain days when fresh biscuits were delivered to the supermarkets and they would be ready and waiting to buy their stock. John was a serious guitarist. He played in the coffee bars in the 60s. And Sarah had been learning over the years, but had never achieved any, remarkable standard. One of the paintings which was displayed in the sitting room for periods of time was of John teaching Sarah the guitar. These lessons were not always happy ones. John was quite an aggressive teacher, and he told me after Sarah's death that his father had been distressed by his style and would sometimes interrupt and complain. From the studio, a half door, one of William Roberts's handmade doors, led you into their bedroom. At the side of her bed there was a painting, a watercolour, of Sarah reading in bed together with a young man. And I said to Sarah one day, "Who is your companion?" "Well," she said, "he gave me a companion. It's nobody I know. There was nobody there. I was just reading in bed." By her bed was again one of the little round tables they fancied so much, and, as in John's poem, one of the poems he wrote after her death, he said, "I'll keep, as long as I am able, a life of Hazlitt at her bedside table." Hazlitt was her favourite author, and she loved discussing his essays, his life. We often talked about him. She woke up also not just to her fine picture, but to a view of the canal every day, passing boats. The houses opposite marked their very strong shapes against the sky, and the room was full of light. To point this up, she always chose yellowish curtains and yellowish gold-covered bed covers, often of Indian weave. All the curtains in the house fell into their chosen aesthetic pattern, a certain range of colours which was permitted. There was no red, there were no flowered patterns, there were stripes in orange, yellow ochre, grey perhaps, yellow, cream, and so on. There was a very strong feeling for these colour schemes. And when the colours didn't suit, she would dye them. She would ring one up and say, "I'm dyeing today. Is there anything you'd like? I'm dyeing brown," or "I'm dyeing green." She dyed shirts for John and for William. She dyed clothes to blend in with other colours that she had in mind. And she would hang out her washing and her dyed clothes on the clothesline. She was the last person in the Crescent to do so, rather to the annoyance of the newer, grander neighbours. She had a little peg basket. It was a great pleasure to follow her, and she kept one or two ragged items which she hung up specially to annoy what she called the Lord, that is her neighbour, Lord St. David's, but I don't think he was that annoyed. Many of her friends describe her as dressing in Oxfam, as though she was some kind of bag lady, but that isn't fair. She certainly bought at Oxfam because she couldn't afford expensive clothes, but she chose with care, she altered, she dyed, she was a clever fiddler with a needle and cotton. The upper floor was forbidden territory, and it was the residence of their only son John. Sarah was 19 when he was born, and in old age many people thought they looked like husband and wife. The room in the front of the house, upstairs, was where they stored paintings and where they entertained possible buyers, so at least they were taken upstairs, but visitors to the house, no. John himself had been a guitarist, a book collector and a dealer, a writer and a poet. The house was full of guitars. There were 26 of them. Both he and Sarah played. Later, after his father's death, Sarah made John agent for his father's work, and he took over the business of selling, buying, organising exhibitions. In his own rooms, he kept his books, and as the years went by, there were more and more and more books everywhere. There were the books he had published himself, which he tried to sell privately, with some success, but we found after his death the big parcels which we opened, which lie on the floor in the top room. His father had died in 1980, after his usual day's work at his easel. He and Sarah then lived a much more sociable life, very companionable. They went out to parties whenever they were invited. Sarah was the life and soul of everyone. And even on the day of her death, when she was 92, she had risen from her bed to make a cup of coffee for a visitor who was coming to see her. John wrote, "Slight the farewell that she took, my mother, she just ceased to live. Without a word or backward look, we were not so demonstrative." That certainly would apply to all three. John himself died 3 years later, after Sarah's death, quite suddenly, in the studio below, and in his hand was a little poem which he'd just been writing about walking up the stairs, and how he remembered Sarah lightly walking up the self-same stairs of the house which was so much the Roberts house.